sure why they keep... I know our country does not do this, however, I do find it strange that a lot of other countries other than ours, they do not allow the kids' names to be revealed. However, the victims' names are kind of put everywhere. I don't know why. So, Brittany had come to Collie via a series of unfavorable circumstances. Her mother's 3 failed marriages were not helping. Brittany's own father had walked out when she was just 3 years old, leaving her mother completely destitute. Struggling to make ends meet, Susan Smith had brought her family to the scruffy coal mining town of Collie, one of the few places in the States where rents were affordable to her. It was at primary school that Brittany met Julie. The girls, with just 4 days in age between them, so they were the same sign, hit it off immediately. Julie unfortunately had a similar circumstance growing up and path through life up to that point. Her father had died of a drug overdose when she was just 4, where she had then been raised by her mother and later by a stepfather. Then in June 2002, the family had been involved in a serious car accident that killed her mother and left her stepbrother seriously injured. Julie had survived, and so did her stepfather Peter, who had taken on the task of raising her and her stepbrother. Although apparently a pretty good guy, he took on this very difficult task of raising the both of them on his own. But unfortunately, Julie had kept this deep-seated resentment towards him that it was his fault that her mother had died. And she would often express this in her writings on her computer. Quote, "Why did he live when my mom died?" Unquote. She typed in one entry. She probably expected that no one would ever read those, but unfortunately they did. But someone else did read it, and Peter was using his stepdaughter. When Peter was using his stepdaughter's computer, he discovered the writings. Julie's antagonism hurt him deeply. It irreparably damaged the relationship between them. Within 6 months, she moved out and gone to live with friends from school, or a family, not just friends, but so that is too bad. It really is. Because I don't know, I don't believe in reading if my kid is angry at me and says something in her journal, then that's one thing, and then it's off her chest. The fact that he held that against her, I don't think is really fair to her. But that arrangement didn't work out either. Unfortunately, Brittany begged Susan to let Julie move in with them, and this is really what gave these two the opportunity to get close and take out their anger and hate towards the world on an innocent bystander. So given their precarious financial situation, Susan was less than keen on the idea. However, she over a dozen kids in the house, causing havoc, quote, end quote. Susan arrived to find a raucous party in session with blaring music and drunken, drugged-up 14-year-olds. She soon got rid of the group, much to the disgust of Brittany and Julie. Brittany would never forgive her mother for that intervention, which was silly. I mean, what parent in their right mind would let their 14-year-old have a party with drugs and alcohol? I mean, that can't even be logical in her daughter's mind. I guess it was, though. Drugs were rife among teenagers in this town of Collie, and both Brittany and Julie soon fell into the culture. Brittany was changing in other ways too, in the way she dressed, in the music she listened to, in her academic performance and school attendance. Even more frightening, she had begun to self-harm, cutting herself, and being able to see them all up and down her arms. She was not embarrassed of them. Rightly or wrongly, Susan put much of this down to Julie's influence. By 2004, she decided that it would probably be better if Julie moved out. It was to a farm 12 miles outside of town, to the home of another school friend. However, her new surrogate mother was soon dealing with similar problems to what Susan had endured. Julie was surly, insolent, and unresponsive. She often expressed dark thoughts and spoke frequently of suicide. Eventually, she carried through on that thread, cutting so deeply into her wrists that she had to be airlifted to a hospital in Perth, 120 miles away. Julie would recover from her ordeal and return to the home of her surrogate mom. When the woman's marriage failed and she moved from the farm into town, Julie came with her. This was bad news for Susan. Previously, there had been distance between the girls. Now that that distance was gone, and Brittany fell into the old habits with her friend. True haunting from school, taking drugs, and hanging out with the gangs of unruly youngsters that were commonplace in Collie. Things eventually came to a head in November 2005. Susan refused to allow one of Brittany's friends to stay at the house. Brittany responded by saying that she was leaving too. Over the weeks that followed, she stayed away, crashing at the house of various friends, while Susan tried desperately to bring her home. With the police unable to help, Susan eventually turned to the Collie Family Center, which arranged for Susan and Brittany to see a counselor. So this is really leading up to not a good situation. I can see it as this author is laying this out. These two girls with the drugs and the kind of self-abuse. Yeah, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. Now that they're together, it's almost as if when you bring two people that have these thoughts that maybe they wouldn't have carried out alone, when you put them together, it gives them more power. But Brittany insisted on speaking to the counselor alone and spun a story about being physically abused. As a result, Susan was told that Brittany was being moved to a safe house and that she was to be absolutely have no contact with her daughter that was not unauthorized. So Brittany's not lying about how her mother is seeing her, or how her mother is treating her, and how she's worker's front lawn. How this could be considered a safe house, I have no idea. Brittany shared this cramped space with another teen, 15-year-old Eliza Jane Davis. Eliza was similar to Brittany in many ways. She liked emo music, dressed in dark clothing, reading bleak poetry. She also enjoyed doing drugs. But Eliza was different when it came to schooling. She was an academically gifted girl and seldom if ever missed a class. So she liked doing drugs, and she liked dressing in dark clothing and writing about evil things. However, she was extremely smart and never missed a class, so that is where those two girls separate. And I could see where Brittany may be forming a little jealousy towards Eliza. So the reason she was living in the caravan was to be close to her preferred school, Collie High. So this girl was actually not running away from her family. She was only living in that safe house because she wanted to go to the school, which was way too far from either of her parents' house. For Susan, this was a difficult time, separated from her daughter and worried about her well-being. She would often drive around town hoping to get a glimpse of her. That's sad. Sometimes she would take her food, but the relationship was at a low ebb. Susan then got troubling news. So Brittany had actually been removed from the caravan and living in a tent in the bush. Fortunately, this was soon resolved, and a local man offered to let Brittany and Eliza live in a couple of unused rooms in this home. That is really strange that the government would allow, like they would put them in a safe house and then allow them to live in a tent. I don't know, that doesn't make any sense to me. But apparently it does in Australia. I really don't know much about. I have heard where there are really nice areas, and then there are areas that are so kind of forgotten about, or so ill paid attention to. Nobody, really cares about these kids in the town, and I think that's what we saw when we talked about the Snowtown murders, is that this little town had the cops and the killers were best friends, and nobody thought it strange that people kept disappearing around them. So the same thing is kind of happening here too, that these girls are just being, even the one who had she did nothing. She wasn't actually removed from her parents' house. It was just closer to a school so she could further her education. Anyway, so now they're living with a local man in a couple of his unused rooms in his home. So soon Julie was also hanging out at the house, and the trio, they were smoking copious amounts of cannabis or marijuana. They were also taking harder drugs whenever they could get their hands on them. Fabulous. And so, to the morning of June 18th, 2006, the murder that would catapult the small town of Collie onto the front page of every newspaper in Australia. Brittany, Julie, and Eliza had hosted a party the previous evening, taking advantage of their landlord's absence. During the party, the girls had all smoked cannabis and taken asked, "Why would you kill your friend?" Quote, "We did it because we felt like it," unquote. Brittany later confessed, quote, "It's hard to explain," unquote. "I think, just like I said earlier, it was a recipe for jealousy. The fact that she was so smart, had family that loved her, and the only reason she was in the same predicament as Brittany was because she wanted to further her education, and both her parents lived way too far away from Collie High School. So having decided to, the girls had decided to commit the murders, they changed into old clothes, and they started rooting around the house for tools that they would need. A length of speaker wire would serve their purposes for strangulation, and they also rustled up a cloth and some household chemicals. This, they believed, could be used to render their victim unconscious. Eliza entered the room without any inkling of what was about to happen. She trusts these girls. These were her friends. She felt a companionship with them. However, she was immediately confronted by Julie, who clamped a chemical-soaked cloth over her mouth. Then Brittany looped the speaker wire around her throat and pulled it tight. Eliza fought hard for her life, but she was outnumbered and outmuscled. Eventually, her struggle subsided and she went limp. Brittany lowered her to the floor and Julie checked for a pulse. There was no pulse. These two young killers then dragged the victim down the dirt floor in the cellar. There they dug a 2-foot deep trench and buried her. Wow. Later that afternoon, the police in Collie received a call from an apparently distressed Brittany, who reported that her friend Eliza was missing. Now, this is not real brilliant, if I may say so myself, that if you're going to kill somebody and then call the police, I would highly recommend you don't bury the body 2 feet down underneath the house. A search was launched with Brittany among the civilian volunteers. Julie, meanwhile, had departed for Perth. She would remain there for the next 3 days before walking into a police station and confessing her part in the murder. At that very moment, Brittany was doing the same, confessing to the police in Collie that she had murdered her friend. These synchronized confessions had not been pre-planned. It was just another odd twist in a bizarre case. The most sickening thing about the murder was the total lack of motivation. Eliza had done nothing to antagonize her friends. She was just collateral damage because these two wanted to kill somebody. It could have been anybody that was there and easy to kill. Maybe if the landlord had been there, he would have been dead. Brittany explained, quote, "It just felt right," unquote. Quote, "Or at least it didn't feel wrong," unquote. That, to me, is incredibly scary. For killing somebody, us know that being a teenager is not fun. High school sucks. Middle school sucks. A life of a teenager is full of peer pressure, stress, hormones changing, of all to fit in. Everybody wants to have that group they fit in with. That kid. Nobody wants to be that kid. But the funny thing is those kids turn out the best in a lot of ways. Take Bernadette Protti, for example. If they can make it through high school, of course. So take Bernadette Protti, for example. Back in 1984, Bernadette was a 15-year-old freshman attending Marymount High School in Orinda, an affluent city in Contra Costa County, California. Pretty and at least somewhat popular, Bernadette was never in danger of being cast adrift from the school's in crowd. But Bernadette had ambitions that went beyond just fitting in. She wanted a spot in the school's yearbook committee. Even more than that, she wanted to be a cheerleader. Unfortunately, she would be turned down on both counts. It was a twin rejection that left her bitter and angry. Now, I hear about this stuff all the time. Kids didn't get this, or kids didn't get that. Well, maybe she wasn't cut out for that, or maybe she didn't practice hard enough. You know, we're not all gonna get everything we want in life. So also attending Marymount High School, there was a 15-year-old Kristen Costas, the quintessential high school deb. Kristen was from a wealthy family and was one of the most popular girls in school. She was also in Bernadette's inner circle and considered her a friend. What Kristen did not know was that Bernadette had begun to fixate on her, to blame her for all her problems in life, not just her school, but all her life problems as well. After all, Kristen had a place on the yearbook committee. She was on the cheerleading squad, and those were spots that Bernadette believed should have been hers. She resented Kristen for taking those from her. No one had any idea of how deep that resentment would run. On the afternoon of June 23rd, 1984, Kristen's mom got a call from a girl who identified herself as Bernadette. She said that she was phoning on behalf of the Bobolinks, a sort of sorority group at Marymount High. Kristen had joined the group, and Bernadette wanted to invite her to an initiation dinner that night. The dinner was at 8, and Bernadette said that she would pick Kristen up herself. Since Kristen was not home at the time, her mother promised to pass the message on. And of course, Bernadette was punctual. Even if the dinner invitation turned out to be false, a ruse, a joke, a hoax. Rather than driving to a restaurant, she stopped on a dark street and told Kristen that she wanted to talk. She then started accusing her friend of being out to get her, stealing her places on the cheerleading squad and stealing her place on the yearbook committee. How crazy is this? Kristen was taken aback, of course, by these accusations, because I'm sure Kristen felt that she was worthy of those places. She assured Bernadette that she was wrong house was only a short distance away. Before long, Alex Arnold and his passenger were pulling outside. Noticing that the house was in darkness, Kristen commented that her parents were probably out. Arnold told her that he would wait at the curb until she was safely inside. Kristen thanked him. She got out of the car. She started walking across the lawn. Then out of nowhere, a figure came sprinting out of the dark and tackled her to the ground. The struggle lasted no more than a few seconds. Sitting in his car, Alex Arnold saw several blows struck before the attacker ran off. He immediately set off in pursuit, but stopped halfway down the block when he realized that he should probably be checking on Kristen. By the time he got back, one of Costa's neighbors had emerged and was attending to the stricken girl. It was then that Arnold saw the blood and realized that what he had just witnessed. He thought it was a fist fight. Now he saw that Kristen had been brutally stabbed. Kristen Costas was rushed to a nearby hospital and taken immediately into surgery. But it was already too late. 5 knife wounds had been inflicted that ran so deep and had pierced vital organs and blood vessels. The weapon used was later determined as having at least an 18-inch blade. Most probably it was a kitchen knife. Kristen never stood a chance. She died on the operating table. How sad is that over the cheerleading team and over the yearbook committee? You murder somebody. In the aftermath of the tragedy, a pall of fear descended on the city of Orinda. People stayed home at night and doors and windows were securely locked. There were fears that a psychopath was stalking the streets. The police, meanwhile, were conducting their inquiries, which included questioning the girl's friends. Since Bernadette had picked her up that night, she came in for particular scrutiny, but held up really well under interrogation. She even passed a lie detector test. Bernadette admitted to the police that she had invented the story of the bobolinks dinner, but she denied that she had done so for any sinister purpose. She had only wanted to get Kristen alone so they could talk about their failing friendship. Kristen, however, had become angry when she learned that the dinner invitation was a lie. She had jumped out of the car and ran off into the night. That was the last time that Bernadette had seen her alive, or so she said. Bernadette's story about her last fateful meeting with her friend would stand up to police scrutiny for nearly 6 months. Indeed, it would have held up even longer. It might even have allowed a killer to get away with the murder. But then, was years before her release, June 1992. Thereafter, she promptly left California, changed her name. Her current whereabouts are unknown, although she is rumored to be married and living in Oregon. Now let's think about this for a second. You're married to somebody, you don't know their real name, and you have no idea that they're capable of murdering somebody in cold blood with an 18-inch kitchen knife. That it's not even. When I hear that somebody is staring at somebody else in the face and stabs them 5 times or more, whatever, I mean, that is personal hate. There's no way you can tell me that a 16 or 17-year-old would then change 20 years later. Just not even, you know what I mean? I don't know, I think that's crazy, crazy, crazy. The next one is Bill Chuck High School in Maryville, Washington. Jalen was popular with a sunny outlook on life. He had a large circle of friends and a steady girlfriend in 15-year-old Shailene George. He was a keen athlete who represented his school at wrestling and football. He had recently been announced as the freshman homecoming prince. But then sometime in mid-2014, something changed. Jalen became quieter, more withdrawn. His academic performance, never spectacular to begin with, slipped. His girlfriend broke up with him. She said he had become violent towards her. No one could say that it was what it was that brought about this dramatic change in him. Later, after the dust settled, many would put it down to a fight that he had with another student. During the course of that altercation, his adversary had used a racial slur. Jalen was a member of the Tulalip Native American tribe and proud of his heritage. The tribe cut deep, even when his friends told him to ignore it. And there were other consequences to the fight. Jalen was suspended from school and cut from the football team. So now he's really all the things that gave him his self-esteem and how he felt towards himself were now taken away. It was then that he returned from suspension that his friends first noticed the change. Some of them even tried to talk to him about it, but Jalen insisted that everything was fine, so they let it be. On October 24th, 2014, several of Jalen's inner circle received a text from him asking to meet up in the school cafeteria at 10:40. That morning, some of them protested that they had class and at that time. But Jalen urged them to skip out, saying that what he had to tell them was important. Intrigued by this, all of them eventually agreed. Included in the invited group were Jalen's cousins Andrew Freiberg and Nate Hatch, Andrew's girlfriend Zoe Galasso, and 2 other girls, Gia Soriano and Shaylee Chuckle-Noskit. The group was already seated at a table among 150 other students in the cafeteria. Jalen entered at 10:39. Intriguingly, he did not sit with his friends, but he dropped into a seat at a nearby table for what he would be quite a while, furiously typing into his cell phone. When he rose and walked across to where his friends were sitting, Nate flashed him a smile, but Jalen did not return the smile. Instead, he launched into a verbal triad against his startled friends. Soon every other student in the room two other boys seated at the table. Unable to flee, those wounded students were now at the shooter's mercy. Wow. So in 30 seconds, all those people were hit. In many of the tragic school shootings that plagued our society, there are tales of heroism and some individual who steps into the breach at great personal risk and prevents further bloodshed. In this case, it was first-year social studies teacher named Megan Selleberger. The teacher had almost been trampled in the initial stampede, but had forced her way past the panic rush of the kids to confront Freiberg. She made a grab for Freiberg's arm, but Freiberg shook her off. Had he decided to turn the gun on her, there would have been little that Miss Selleberger could have done about it. But Freiberg didn't do that. Instead, he raised the gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. As he collapsed to the floor, Megan Selleberg reached for her phone and punched in 911. But for her intervention, Freiberg might well have finished the job on the students that he initially winged. As it was, Freiberg had exacted a heavy toll. The first police officer was on the scene within minutes, but was already too late. The shooter, Jalen Freiberg, was dead. Also was a 17-year-old Zoe Glasso. The 14-year-old Zoe Glasso. Gia Soriano, Shaylee Chucknall-Skit, Andrew Freiberg, and Nate Hatch were all seriously injured and rushed to a nearby hospital. Hatch would survive his wounds, but the other victims would all succumb to their injuries over the next week. Soriano and Chucknall-Skit were 14 and on the day they died. Andrew Freiberg was just 15. The two other students who had been hit had suffered slight injuries. They were treated and discharged the same day. In the aftermath of the shootings, there would be many questions asked, few of which would garner satisfactory answers. The first and perhaps most important was why. Why would a student of 15, being described by his classmates and teachers as a really nice kid, suddenly turn into a homicidal maniac? Many answers have been proffered. Freiberg's angry reaction to the racial slur directed at him, his breakup with his girlfriend, his axing from the football team. None of these make sense if we look at the victims he targeted, though. He must have borne some particular grudge against these individuals, and the closest we get is his romantic overtures towards Zoe Glasso and a rejection of those advances. Zoe had been dating Freiberg's cousin, Andrew, and had told him that she cared for Andrew and was happy in the relationship. Was it perhaps that perceived slightly that tipped Jalen over the edge? Certainly the first shots that he fired were aimed at Zoe and Andrew. Since Jalen is not here to answer for his actions, we will never know for certain. Aside from motive, the key evidentiary question for the police was the source of the murder weapon. It was a .40 caliber Beretta PX4 Storm handgun that had belonged to Freiberg's father. It turned out that Raymond Lee Freiberg was barred from owning a gun due to a previous order of protection against him for domestic violence offenses. Freiberg had lied about this on the application form, and in fact, a acquired 5 firearms since the banning order. He was ultimately prosecuted for these offenses and sentenced to 2 years in prison. One other mystery still needs to be resolved. What had Jalen Freiberg been typing into his phone just before he launched his deadly attack? The answer is that it is both startling and bizarre. He typed up a group text messages to the families of the victims, apologizing for what he was about to do. A second message went to his own family, laying out plans for his funeral. This is truly a bizarre and sad case. I had never heard of this case. However, it is truly one of the most horrific ones I have read on kids